Welcome to Transnational Competition Law course, and dear learner and viewer, today I am going to discuss embarrassment of extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries. Dear learner and viewers, during the last many lectures, we have been discussing the enforcement of extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries. Now we will try to have a kind of a switch over that as to what constitute enforcement, which have been dealt very extensively in 3-4 lectures in terms of its application and enforcement in United States, in European Union, in developing and developed countries, the South American countries, African countries, Asian countries, primarily India, Russia, and Turkey in the West Asia. And what we did in the entire exposition of enforcement of extraterritorial application of competition law in developing country happens to be that there are many broad trends and generalization. The first happens to be that there are countries which have taken advantage of express verbis incorporation of extraterritorial application of competition law provision in their competition law statutes and rules and policies. The other kind of the countries which we have studied have not incorporated per se the extraterritorial application of competition law in their statute. However, the judicial organ and the competition authorities, national competition authorities, have tried to elucidate the concept under the single economic entity doctrine, implementation doctrine, and effect doctrine of the US antitrust law, and judicially recognized extraterritorial application of competition law for the enforcement and execution of any kind of the practices which is known as abuse of dominance, cartelization. We have seen those countries which does not possess any specific provision on the extraterritorial application of competition law in their national statutes, rules, regulation, and policies. Nonetheless, through the instrumentality of the national competition authorities as well as the judicial organ, they have harmoniously constructed and interpreted three major doctrines, two which has been in practice in the United European Union, the one the single economic entity doctrine, and the other is the implementation doctrine, and the third pertains to the antitrust law and the doctrine of United States, the effect doctrine, to provide a very respectable space to the extraterritorial application of competition law. The third category of the countries what we have deciphered is neither having any kind of a statutory backup regarding the extraterritorial application of competition law, nor their national authorities are capacitated to understand how to investigate in matters of cartel, in matters of abuse of dominance, in matters of regulation of combination, in matters of anti competitive behavior, in matters of price fixing, in matters of predatory pricing, and many of the conduct which have deleterious and pernicious tendencies on the domestic market. And there are country still has to come into the grips that what are the relative merits and the demerits of not having a kind of a system of extraterritoriality or extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries. They are still not in a position to grapple and understand that how the absence of the extraterritorial application of the competition law in one's country is very harmful to the free flow of the goods and services and fostering competition in their domestic jurisdictions. Dear learner, with this background, we will try to understand that enforcement as one part which has been taken care of in many lectures, and I have tried to be as simple and lucid in exposing that what are the intricacies, the problems, the hiccups and hurdles in the enforcement. Today, I am going to discuss another important topic of our significance, which happens to be what we call is the extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries. We have to first thing first, dear learner, first thing first, we have to decipher the differences between the enforcement and embarrassment. Embarrassment means that how this country have embarrassed the provisions of extraterritorial application of competition law. And in matters of embarrassment, what we find that if we go into details that how the different countries have reacted to the embarrassment of the transnational or extraterritorial application of competition law, then one major source of our lecture happens to be the United Nations publication on developing countries' experience with extraterritoriality in competition law, which has been published in 2021 and is available on Creative Commons for ready reckoning and understanding. What that publication and the paper, which is very erudite in nature and full of scholarship in the sense that it has an empirical survey of all the countries of the world in matters of extraterritorial application of competition law. The study in depth examines that 34 out of 40 jurisdictions in the world have incorporated, recognized, or we can say the embarrassed the domestic competition law in extraterritorial jurisdiction. The study also points out that there are countries which have a clear and cogent textual basis of recognition of extraterritorial jurisdiction of competition law, and there are countries which happens to be in the gradual process of rehabilitation and resettlement and refurbishing of the extraterritorial application on the competition statute. In this reference, the Brazil, the Costa Rica, and Turkey have embarrassed extraterritoriality besides the European Union besides the American Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, in as far back as these countries happens to be very progressive in understanding the relative significance of extraterritoriality of competition law right in 1994. Poland also embarrassed extraterritoriality law on the statute known as counteracting monopolistic practices in national economy in 1987. Then, dear learner, having a cursory glance and survey of the publications and the major findings of the United Nations publication on developing countries' experience with extraterritoriality in competition law, published in 2021, we will be switching over that as to how international competition agreement can provide a kind of a succor and the relief, and will try to provide some impetus, or in other words we can say that how international agreement on competition have been successful in giving a fillip and fill the void if any country have not thought of having any specific statutory provisions of the competition law. In that reference, dear learner and viewer, we will look at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We will also look up some of the recommendations of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We will be also benefiting from some recommendations and some rule, regulations and notification of International Competition Network, and we will try to see that how the set of multilaterally agreed equitable principles and the rules for control of restrictive business practices have been helpful in finding a very prognostic and pragmatic solution if the countries are not having any kind of a statutory recognition of extraterritorial application of competition law. We'll be referring to the UN Conference on Restrictive Business Practices 1980. We will also be taking note of the United Nations General Assembly 1980 UN set of principles, rules on competition, and we will try to understand that what is the purpose and effect test which has been permeated under these soft and hard international law on competition, and we will also look that how the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development model on competition law known as UN set enables to be really a kind of a model law. Dear learner, then in our lecture we will be also discussing, dear learner, then we will be safely tracing the embarrassment of extraterritorial application of competition law in developed and developing countries in the recommendations of Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, their perception and their vision and their mission on the competition law and policy. We will look at the sector specific studies and policy recommendations. We will also try to see that how the document sets the soft law on the issue of extraterritorial application of competition law. We will be referring to Organization of Economic Cooperation Council Recommendation 1995, which fights squarely the anti-competitive practices. We will also see that how Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Council Recommendation 2014 dealt with competitive investigation and proceedings. Thus, the entire corpus of the soft and hard international law, which has been issued time to time by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and as well as the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Besides, dear learner, we will also be taking resort to International Competition Network seminal contribution in preparing the competition policy advisory and creating a kind of the international forum on policies relating to competition law in intergovernmental organization in the process of simplification and cooperation and soft harmonization of the various laws of antitrust and competition law. With this background in mind, we will be slightly moving to the lecture on the embarrassment of extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries in a detailed manner. Dear learner, as I have in the beginning tried to differentiate that the enforcement, be that the subject matter of enforcement, or you can say the executive enforcement, both enforcement taken together, we have to neatly pull out the difference between the enforcement of extraterritorial application of competition law and the embarrassment of the extraterritorial application of competition law. Enforcement comes at the later stage, whereas the embarrassment is the first step, though I am discussing in quick succession to the discussion of the enforcement to bring home the conclusion that the different countries of the world have reacted differently on the issue of extraterritorial application of competition law at their domestic jurisdictions. So, when we study the embarrassment once again, we, for the sake of reiteration, we can mention that the embarrassment of extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries is equally important than the enforcement of extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries. Therefore, it's very appropriate and it will not be out of place to mention one of the seminal contribution and the publication of United Nation on study on the developing countries' experiences with extraterritorial application of competition law published in 2021 and is available on the website as Creative Commons. And that report of the United Nations, which is of a very recent origin, meaning thereby the since last 3 decades, as we refer to John M. Connon's study comprising of 26 years and which we referred in matters of enforcement of competition law. This is another seminal contribution which can be taken note and should be read very religiously to draw a kind of a panorama and the framework as to how the entire process and the passage of law in matters of universal applications and the particular applications, or we can say that how the universalism and the particularism of international law have reacted to the provisions of extraterritorial application of competition law. This paper vividly portray the entire intricacies and diversity of different countries. Here, it will not be out of place to mention that if you look at the range of the country which are selected in the document are something very wide, and and it matters that it uses all kinds of language: the English, the Hispanic, the Russian, the Arabic, and many other international languages. So many countries have their laws and policies in their vernacular language. So this study have been very meticulously examined the salient features of the laws of developing countries to reach to the conclusion that as to what remains the ambit, scope, and the purview of the extraterritorial application of competition law. In that respect, dear learner, it has come out with a startling revelation that the country happens to be surveyed, happens to be randomly 40 countries this study have focused on, and out of the 40 countries, 34 countries happens to participate in the survey which has been conducted by the United Nations organization in Geneva, and that forms the basis of some of the generalizations, recommendations, and suggestions of the work of United Nations. What it says that out of 40 jurisdictions of the world, only 34 countries have participated in the, meaning thereby there are still countries which have to come into the grip of the competition law. They have to really understand and realize the broader goals of the competition law in not only fostering the consumer welfare, producers' welfare, but augmenting the domestic market and the global trade in that sense. With this, dear learner, what we will examine in reference to this article is of great importance, and here we can just take note of that the 34 countries which participated in the survey in relation to the issue of embarrassment of the extraterritorial application of competition law. So 34 countries said yes, we agree to the entire survey, and we earnestly cooperate with the entire survey to give a kind of a glimpse, an idea that how the enforcement vis-a-vis the embarrassment of the extraterritorial application of competition law is being triggered in our country. The entire passage of the law has been cooperated by 34 countries, and these 34 countries, dear learner, happens to be Albania, Argentina, Belarus, Botswana, Brazil, Chile, China, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Egypt, Eswatini, Honduras, India, Kenya, Malaysia, Mexico, Namibia, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Peru, Philippines, Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Serbia, South Africa, Turkey, Ukraine, United Republic of Tanzania, Vietnam, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And the countries which have said specifically no to what you say that about the embarrassment of the extraterritorial application of competition law, these countries are Armenia, El Salvador, Guyana, Indonesia, Jamaica, and Malawi. And the source happens to be that if you look at the source United Nations developing countries experience with extraterritorial application in competition law, 2021, published from Geneva, the page number 4 provides a list, and it also discusses that as to how these countries happens to be lagging and have been a trailblazer in respect to the incorporation of extraterritorial application of competition law. Dear learner, with this, I think that the entire notion and concept of embarrassment we can easily understand as we have tried to understand the entire mechanism of enforcement of extraterritorial application of competition law in developed and developing countries. It is equally important for us to understand that how the embarrassment or incorporation and recognition of extraterritorial application of competition law in developing countries can be made possible. Thank you very much. Have a happy learning.